Good morning. I'm Laura McNamara from the East Providence Area Chamber of Commerce, and we are so happy to have everybody here this morning for our Pokanokets and Pilgrims, the 17th century conflict. And David Weed is here from the Soames Area Project, and he is going to, Soames Heritage Area Project. He's going to be talking about what was going on in this area as well as the Soames area, and he's going to explain what Soames is and was. And East Providence is a big part of that, actually, so we're really excited to bring that information to the public and also to help David get the word out. So without further ado, let's turn it over to David Weed, and it's all yours.
Thank you, Laura. You can hit the lights now. As Laura said, I'm Dave Weed. I coordinate a project that a number of us started about 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago now, to bring back the 17th century in the region between Bristol and Providence. I got interested because I live right back up there behind Burrs Hill Park in Warren. If you've ever been there, you drive down Water Street and then you see the beach on the right, and then Burrs Hill Park is on the left. And one morning a couple of years ago, I woke up and heard them excavating. I thought, well, this is interesting. I wonder what they're doing. And I'll explain a little bit more what was going on. So, what was going on behind my backyard was that they were reburying the Massasoit, Watchemoket, who had been dug up at Burrs Hill in 1913 by Charles Carr, the then town librarian in Warren, who was an amateur archaeologist, who got tired of all kinds of skeletons and burial objects being removed from Burrs Hill when they began building the railroad starting in 1854, which is now the East Bay Bike Path. So Carr got permission to excavate 42 grave sites, and then took those items out, sent them, some of them to Brown and Harvard and the Hay Museum in New York City, and kept a few for his own collection at on the second floor of the George Hale Library. And those items were there until about 2010 or so, when we were approached by the Mashpee tribe, who was in the process of reclaiming those burial items from all the sources where they had been dispersed, and gathered those up. And in 2017, they got permission from the town, dug the hole in the ground, and put over 600 burial items back in the ground in a sealed vault. So that was my introduction to Watchemoket, who, as you recall, was the guy who met the Plymouth colony in March of 1621, and in that process entered into a peace treaty with the English that lasted for over 50 years. That treaty guaranteed the survival of both the native population and the colonists. It was a critical item there. We now celebrate Thanksgiving as a symbol of the mutual friendship between the two, but there's a lot of history that happened between the fall of 1621 and then the King Philip War in 1675. So this presentation is going to help you understand what changed after the Mayflower, leading up to the King Philip War. People have been living in this area for 8,000 to 10,000 years. That includes the area you're in now. This is the Seekonk Plain. There have been archaeological excavations down at Kettle Point and other places throughout this area, so we have physical evidence of people living here that long ago. And to the best of our knowledge, because there's no written history for those 10,000 years, we believe the people lived here successfully. That is, they were able to survive well and prosper, and in fact, this particular area that we call Soames, which was the area between Bristol and Providence was very highly favored because of its access to water, and therefore fish and clamshells and clams and everything else that you could get from the water, as well as access to the forest nearby where you could hunt. Well, this area was essentially dominated by a tribe called the Pokanokets. Now, most people hear the word Wampanoag when they talk about native people around here. Well, that name Wampanoag didn't come into usage until after the King Philip War, when there was an effort to expunge Pokanokets from the area, including their language, their identity, and in fact, after the war, people were either killed outright, many of them, or enslaved and shipped out of the area, particularly to Barbados. So this was an early act of cultural genocide. There's no other way to describe it. It was basically, we're getting rid of the people who started the war in 1675. But what they had to do was to get rid of a population that numbered probably 100,000 or so. It's difficult to say because there was no census at the time. But the area occupied by the Pokanoket tribe extended all the way up to the Charles River near Boston, and all the way over to Nutaconaket Hill in Providence, and all the way out to Martha's Vineyard and the islands, but did not include Cape Cod, which is where the Mashpees were residing, who allied with the English during the war and who were rewarded for that alliance with their own property there and a reservation. And you can visit that reservation any time. The Pokanokets, however, were disappeared. The first encounter that I mentioned was an opportunity for the native population to get to know the English and vice versa. They were aided by two men who spoke English, who were native people. One, Samoset, who had learned some broken English from the traders north of Boston that he had encountered over the years. But then Tisquantum, or Squanto, who had been taken by some of the traders back to England, and he had resided there for several years and learned English quite well. So when he came back on a ship, we think in 1619, a trading ship, he entered his former village of Patuxet, or what we know as Plymouth, only to find in horror that everyone he knew was dead. In fact, there were so many people who had died there that there were nothing but bleached bones on the ground in his village. There wasn't there weren't enough people alive to bury the dead. So with that, when he saw the Pilgrims arrive, he needed to make contact with them and did so, and began by speaking with them to understand why they were there. This was something new. Up until that time, though there had been trading people for probably 100 years before the arrival of the Pilgrims, no one came to colonize, to stay. And it was only men who came over. This time on the Mayflower, you had women and children. So the native population knew that something was different. The Pokanokets kept their distance at first. Remember that they arrived in Plymouth in December, wintered over, mostly staying on the ship, but many of them died. 50 of the 102 people who came were dead by the following March. So things weren't looking good, and they knew little about how they were going to get more food, how they were going to grow food there, until Tisquantum began to teach them not only how to grow corn and other plants, but also where to fish and how to catch fish in that area. So literally their physical survival depended on that relationship with the Pokanokets. The description of the Massasoit, we don't have any drawing or painting of him, so we don't know exactly what he looked like. The picture you see is from the statue that was erected in Plymouth in the 1930s. But this is a description of him, which doesn't really match what you see on the statue. And it was usual for native people at that time to paint their faces, oil their head and face. So that's how he was attired. They wore a breechcloth and not much else, particularly in the warmer months. And must have looked somewhat fierce and unapproachable to the English. But then again, if you think of being a native person, seeing the English and what they were wearing and how they were dressed, who is the most unapproachable? Okay. The people were described much as Verrazano had described them, as being tall, muscular men and very graceful looking women. So this was a healthy population, as opposed to the English, who had suffered more than 2 months in their voyage across and then spending time aboard ship. They were filthy dirty, they stunk, they were emaciated from lack of food. This was not a happy group of campers, let me tell you. So I think seeing when the Massasoit came in March of 1621 and saw the condition they were in, he had nothing to fear about their military might, but did note that they had something he and no other tribe had: guns and cannons. And he began to calculate that this was a group, despite the fact that he had lost over 90% of his population along the coast there, he and his remaining warriors were still in pretty good shape living down here in Somes. He calculated that the way to prevent the Narragansetts, who were breathing down his neck, who had already taken the area that we know as Providence on that side of the Seekonk River, and who had an interest in moving into this area because of its vast resources, he decided that he would strike an alliance with the English known as the Wampanoag Treaty. Now that's misnamed because there were no Wampanoags. That name was not in use at that time, but that's what it's called. The treaty basically spelled out how the mutual protection would occur between both of them. There was another concern that the Massasoit had when he entered Patuxet, and that was, would he and his warriors also die the same way that his relatives had died 3 years before from what he didn't know was an infectious disease outbreak. So they kept their distance, but then determined that they would probably be safe enough, and then came and met. This 6-point treaty specified no harm and mutual defense. It required that they share knowledge about the land and the valuable goods that the English brought. Remember, other than some trading that had already occurred, the tribes did not have access to steel, like knives, hatchets, axes, etc., woven cloth, okay, versus just furs, and pottery. None of those were technologies that they had. So they were very interested in sharing that. And of course, the Pilgrims were interested in learning how to survive. So the two profited greatly by that early relationship. They also had agreed to mete out justice. If there was wrongdoing on either side, that each side would take care of their own. And they began to talk about land sales, but we'll talk more a little bit about that. Here's their 6 points of the treaty. It basically that neither should do injure or do hurt any of our people. If any, the offender should be sent to each side for justice. If the tools were taken away, they should be restored. If they did unjustly war, in other words, they would protect each other from other enemies coming in. And in fact, just later that year, they had to go up and defend themselves against an attack near Boston, or what became Boston. When they come to you, they should leave their bows and arrows behind, as do our pieces, that is, our guns, when we come to meet. Okay, so that was the agreement that was struck and held for 50 years. That last time was you have to do allegiance to King James, of course, who owned everything. So what we have are two cultures that differed greatly, that did not see the world in the same way, coming together in mutual dependence. Very interesting situation. Some of the major differences are that the native people lived with the land. They were part of the land. In fact, they didn't even have a name for themselves. They only named the land because the land was part of them. Whereas the English came to acquire, purchase, and develop the land, to live on it, not with it in harmony with nature. The native population hunted animals, whereas the English brought their own animals with them, domesticated animals like cows and sheep. The native population had never seen an animal like that, had never raised an animal, had never thought that animals should become your property. The only animals that they cultivated or domesticated were dogs. And even then just for hunting, and they were more like kind of domesticated wolves than pets. English would acquire land where the native population would only manage it. There would be use agreements, not purchases. In other words, we'll agree to have you use this land for hunting or fishing, but nobody owned anything. God owned the land. And an acceptance of how things should be. The native population accepted the world as it was and dealt with it, whereas the English were there to dominate and to change and to alter. Religion. Of course, the English were all separatist Protestant Christians, and I won't go through the entire history of the separatists in England, and but we certainly all understand that the reason they came from Leiden, Amsterdam, because they had gone there from England to escape persecution in England. So coming to America, they saw an opportunity to practice their religion. And even though less than half of them were separatists, the other crew were people who just signed on and helped to pay for the voyage. There was a major attempt to maintain a separatist Protestant religion in Plymouth. But they weren't going to limit it to that, because the native population were subject to conversion. In fact, that was part of their mission, was to convert anybody they encountered. Okay? The native population never tried to convert the English. They also didn't want to convert themselves to the English way of religion. And you might read Roger Williams, who probably had a much better understanding of the native population's views of God and nature, and who often described the native population as more Christian than the Puritans who were coming over here. The Puritans, especially up in Boston, because they welcomed him, sheltered him without knowing him, took him in as a stranger, and he could never understand why the English would never do that. So the colonists began working to convert the Indians to Christianity, particularly starting around 1650 with John Eliot and established praying towns, particular towns that Native people would go to when they wanted to convert or agreed to be converted, where they would not only have to change their religious views away from their native views, but they would also have to change their dress, their hair, their language. Everything had to change. It was a total cultural conversion. So these praying towns exercised control. They were established primarily as a social organization, and that system stayed intact even into the 18th century, after the King Philip War. The provincial authorities continued to insist on appointing or approving all Indian leaders and approving all laws and ordinances enacted by Indian people. Do you think we would get away with that today? I don't think so. Okay. They had different views of work, of labor. There was continuous labor was expected for men and women in the English society. Laziness was a sign of spiritual ill health. So both men and women were expected to work every moment of the day, sunrise to sunset, except for Sundays. And on Sunday, you would spend the entire day in church. Okay? That was their habit and pattern. They would observe Native women working in the fields a number of hours, much longer than men were working. The Native men, in fact, were often observed just in the settlements, totally unoccupied. And then they would disappear for periods of time on hunting parties. Well, that was the division of labor that the Native people had. That is to say, women were expected to raise the crops, tend the children, and kind of keep the settlement, the encampment. Whereas the men had two purposes in life. One was to hunt, and the second was to defend, to make war if necessary, or defend against those making war on them. Well, the English looked at that and thought this was totally wrong, that the men were exploiting the women, and that the men were lazy and unproductive. They, of course, didn't follow them on their hunting parties and didn't see them traveling great distances on foot and capturing, or a lot of times they would not only shoot animals, but they would ensnare them, use traps and things of that sort. But they would bring back large sources of meat, but that process would take days, if not weeks. In terms of land ownership, the natives saw themselves and their land as part of themselves, part of their identity, whereas colonists saw land as a commodity, something to be bought and sold. Both Native people and the tribes had common property. That wasn't different. In fact, more of the property in the early days of colonial settlement were in common hands as opposed to private hands. But among the native population, there was no private land. It didn't exist. In fact, there weren't private possessions. If there was a stone tool that no one was using and you needed to do something with it, you used it. Okay? It didn't belong to a particular person. Whereas if you took a tool from an Englishman, you better have had permission from that person. Otherwise, you'd be in court. The colonists often moved into unused land because they felt that any land that wasn't in active use was open to someone else's use or moving in. And in fact, the English were accused of using their animals, pigs and cows in particular, to acquire land because they would not fence those animals in. They would wander into a native garden, eat all the corn and squash and whatever was there, thereby ruining their crops and leaving the native population to abandon that garden. Now the English have acquired more land. So a lot of that land acquisition was by that process as opposed to simply deeds. We talked about gender roles. Men in particular were seen as leaders. There were no English women leaders. In the English worldview, women were subject to men and had no rights except as they got them from their relationship with men. Whereas in the native population, there were equal numbers of female chiefs. Some of you may have heard of Weetamo. Okay, she was a Pocasset native chief. She had as much authority as any other native man chief. There were no distinctions there. And women, in many respects, really ran the show because they would pick their chiefs. It was up to them to observe the men and decide which one they wanted as a chief. Or if a man died, they would sometimes select his wife or another woman in the tribe. And that process goes on today. I'll introduce you to the Pokanoket tribe today, and they just elected a new chief, and she's a woman. Disease was a constant factor, in particular for the native population. We understand today that the English people and other traders, the Dutch and French who came over, had been subject to infectious disease in Europe for centuries, really. And those who survived those infectious diseases were now immune, and they could carry that immunity for life. So when the colonists came to North America, they did not get sick, whereas any contact, even casual contact, with the native population often resulted in events of sickness and death among large numbers. So the population of the natives was diminishing from 1620 to 1675. We don't know, again, all the accurate counts on that, but while the colonial population was growing about 3% every year, the numbers of native people was dropping, probably to the point that by the outbreak of the King Philip War, they went from perhaps as many as 70,000 Pokanokets down to as few as 7,000 in 1675. Okay, lost 90% of their population just over the years with disease and death and the stress of colonization. I think if you observe what's going on with the Rohingyas in Muslim countries, that stress puts a great deal of pressure on any population to not reproduce, so that your numbers begin dropping over time. The whole system of justice changed. Initially, for the first 50 years under Osamequin, they did follow the Wampanoag Treaty and took care of justice on either side. So it wasn't colonists adjudicating wrongs by the natives. The native way is that if somebody, stabs your brother, and then the family is responsible for dealing with that. And whereas the English system, the courts are responsible. Two different ways of handling things. By 1675, the native population right around here, Philip was over here at Mount Hope. He had been losing population. Land was lost. Europeans were surrounding him. Their population was growing. And he was really afraid that they were going to literally lose their whole culture. And they could have. Another 25 years, and there might not have been any Pokanokets left, period. Okay? So, when people are threatened with their lives, what do? You go to war. And that's what he did. Now, you look at the King Philip War. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it. There's a lot you can read about. I would suggest reading Igniting King Philip's War. It goes into all the things that occurred just in the lead up to the war. Between 1670 and 1675, a lot changed. And what I didn't realize is the Pilgrims were no longer leading the charge. It was our good friends in the Mass Bay colony who were doing that, and they were doing things that the Pilgrims never agreed to. Remember, it was the Pilgrims who had the Wampanoag Treaty Agreement, and now you've got the Puritans coming down from Massachusetts imposing all these laws and changing the way justice was meted out. Yes. Okay, so the war crippled both sides. You had 2,500 colonists who died in the war, about 30% of the English population, but about 5,500 Native Americans. Okay, so they really took the hit very hard. Their effort, if you look at the pattern of the war, it looked very much because Philip went right up toward Deerfield in western Massachusetts and was starting to move east to get the colonists to go home, you know. Burn a few villages, get out of here, you know. And some of them did. Some of them went back to England. A lot of them went down to Newport because it was Narragansett territory at the time. But Benjamin Church finally caught up with him, and you get the whole story. And a native person named Alderman, John Alderman, who I found out he was out to get Philip because Philip had killed his brother. So there was a little enmity going on there. But Church's gun misfired, Alderman shot him and killed him, and then the rest from there is history. That pretty much ended the war, though it continued actually for a number of years up into Maine. So the Indians experienced a catastrophic loss of their culture. The colonists purchased more and more land, and then by the time the Indians woke up to the threat posed by the waves of land-hungry settlers, they were often politically and militarily too weak to react decisively. And that's Weidensaul's assessment of that. And the question can be raised, was the Massasoit wrong to have allied with the colonists? We'll never know. He had one vision. Things didn't, after he died, things did not continue the way he wanted it to. Just very quickly, you have the Massasoit Osamequin, who struck the agreement, lived for 50 years, died. Then his son Alexander took over for less than a year, went to Plymouth, and then on his way back died of what the native people think was poisoning. So they were not happy with what happened there, and there may very well have been an attempt to get rid of him and thereby nullify all the agreements. But Philip, who took the name Philip, by the way, because if you're a king, you know, you get an English name. And he was king of his people, so why not call him king? And he took the name Philip. I just heard a couple of days ago that because it wasn't a biblical Christian name, well, there's a whole thing about how the names were chosen. The point was that he wasn't given a Christian name. He took an English name, but he never converted to Christianity. He never wanted to, and that didn't set well with the English either. So after the war, anyone remaining who hadn't been killed was either driven off the land. Many left and went to other tribes in New York and Maine, but a number of them were enslaved and taken down to Barbados. Since that time of the King Philip War, we have engaged in a process called firstings and lastings. This was the first house in Plymouth. Well, was it the first house in Plymouth? No, there have been houses there for 10,000 years. It was the first English house. That was firstings, okay? All the first this and first that and first that and that, okay? Had nothing, just totally ignored the people who had been there before, okay? And then lastings. Oh, that's the last Native American on the vineyard. Oh, that's the last Native chief. Oh, did you know that Rhode Island tried to get rid of all Native people in 1880 by ruling them in the census as you couldn't put yourself down as Native American? okay? You had to be some version of white at that point. We tried to get rid of everybody, okay? That was what was going on for 200 years after the war. Just make them disappear, you know? And not just here, but, you know, the whole Manifest Destiny marching across to the West Coast, the same process, okay? So if you think we never engaged in genocide, no, we invented it.
Yeah.
There, I was here back in June for the Strawberry Harvest Moon Festival. Over 300 Native Americans here. Okay, they're not gone, but people say, well, how do you find them? You know, well,
Google them.
yeah, Google them, look for them, ask people. You know, you have Native American ancestry. This is the group today. You could see any of these people in the grocery store and you wouldn't say, oh, there's a Native American, okay? So understand that they're here and all around. Okay? The people today, you know, who are in their 70s and 80s, grew up through that period. It's not that long ago that you would not want to tell people you were Native American. Now it's somewhat fashionable or okay,
Yeah.
you know, though they still, you know, unless you've been part of an oppressed minority, you really can't get it in terms of what goes on when other people identify you or misidentify you. It's difficult. And you know, the people in the tribe who I talk to all the time, you know, will say they have to live in two worlds. They live in the Western world, and just like the rest of us, I assume, here, and they live in the Native world. I'd like to end with the prayer of the Sagamore today. He wrote just this past year that we cannot go back and relive the past. So our prayer today is that all the descendants of the Pokanoket Nation will find forgiveness and understanding for what transpired in the past. We pray for a better understanding between the Pokanoket people and the inhabitants of Bristol County, Rhode Island, Bristol County, Massachusetts, and the inhabitants of the ancestral realm of the Pokanoket Nation Confederacy, so that we can truly believe and be one nation under God, with liberty and justice for all. He ends with the statement Ayuta, which means stand firm.
Thank you, David.
Oh,
Appreciate
you're
it.
welcome.
David has a YouTube channel with this. This video will be posted there. There are many others of different areas and different topics regarding Solon's Heritage Area. So if you're interested in this, follow up with that. The website is solonsheritagearea.com.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.